Thank you for joining the Nucleate podcast, Allison.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So let's start from the beginning. Tell us a bit about where you grew up and how you came to pursue a career initially as a vet.
So I am from New York. I grew up on Long Island and now live in New York City. I always wanted to be a vet, actually, since kind of the quintessential veterinarian. Since I was 8 years old, I loved animals and I wanted to be a vet. It's actually a funny story. I wasn't sure what I wanted to be. I was in third grade, and my sister's best friend was in the car with my parents, and my dad asked her what she wants to be when she grew up. And I thought she was the most beautiful girl. She was 4 years older than me, and she was just the girl I wanted to be when I grew up. And she said she wanted to be a vet. And then when I started school that September, the teacher said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be a vet." And it was because that girl said she wanted to be a vet. Well, it turns out she's definitely not a vet. But I stuck with it, and she wanted to be a vet, so did I. And I slowly grew to actually wanting to be a veterinarian. But I wanted to be one since I was 8, and I worked very hard to go to the college that I could go to get into vet school and ultimately be where I am. So I wound up going to Cornell University up in Ithaca, New York, went to undergrad and vet school there, and then did my training, my residency at the University of Pennsylvania in internal medicine, and then a fellowship in interventional radiology. So ultimately, I'm an interventional radiologist and an internist for animal.
That's really interesting that someone inspired you to be a vet. She didn't even become one herself.
Exactly.
And so you've had a really interesting journey from, practicing as a vet full time to what you do today. So, very curious to hear about how you pivoted from being the day-to-day full-time internist / interventional radiologist for animals to what you do today. So curious if you can tell us about that journey.
Yeah, so I was a veterinarian for many years. I was practicing internal medicine and interventional radiology in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, and then was lucky enough to be offered a position with my husband. He's a veterinary surgeon and also an interventional radiologist. And basically, we had started the first veterinary interventional radiology program in the world when we were at the University of Pennsylvania. And the largest not-for-profit animal hospital up in New York City had offered for us to start the first IR program for animals, dedicated only full-time to animals for IR. So we came up to New York, we moved to Manhattan, and we ultimately were engaged at the time. We got married and we started this interventional radiology program. And it was wonderful. I was really exactly where I wanted to be in my career. Just published our first textbook, dozens of published articles, teaching, lecturing, traveling the world, doing all the things that I always wanted to do. And it was really an incredibly exciting time in my career. And we decided to start having children. And we had our first daughter. Everything was great. Her name is Kai, and she's now 12. And then we had our second daughter. And at 5 months of age, she was diagnosed with a rare genetic, non-degenerative neurodevelopmental disorder called Angelman Syndrome. And it was obviously totally random, very surprising, incredibly shocking, and quite devastating. As people that planned everything in their lives, we did not plan this, and we didn't really know how to deal with it. And the solution for us was we have to solve it. And I worked really hard my whole career to solve clinical problems that didn't have a solution. The feline ureter was my focus. I had to solve the cat ureter problem. Cats get ureteral obstructions, and people used to just euthanize them for that. And in humans, you treat it, and there are ways to treat it with a great prognosis. And I was committed to fix the feline ureter. And I suddenly had to be committed to fix this single gene disorder. I figured, how hard can it really be? It must be easier than the feline ureter. I was wrong. We've solved the feline ureter problem. We have not solved the single gene disorder problem. But I was naive enough to think we could. And so that really set me off to say, if it's not impossible, it's probably possible. And no one's shown us that it's impossible. So let's give it a shot. And we just jumped in head first and tried to figure out how we can get involved to fix Quincy, my daughter, because she was broken.
It's a really fascinating story, and obviously very sad to hear how Quincy has Angelman syndrome. Can you explain a little bit about what her experience was? It sounds like it's a very scary ordeal when you were, I'm sure, trying to find answers at first for a relatively rare condition. I'm assuming it also took a while to figure out what was even happening.
Yeah, so Quincy was born, my pregnancy was generally totally typical. She was born on time. She had a very easy childbirth, and she was doing great for the first 3 days of life. And at about day 3, she started having really significant reflux, which our first daughter did not have. So it seemed really strange and incredibly disturbing. All of the doctors said that, happy spitter babies spit up. It's very common. Your other daughter just didn't have that. And they did all the things for reflux that you would normally do. But the more, as she was getting older and older and each week was passing, things started to feel aggressively worse, not better. And finally, we, got to about 3 months of age, and she was really delayed in a lot of the things that we were told she should be doing at this point. You get these apps and they tell you at each week postpartum, the things your child should be doing. And she really wasn't doing those things. And our typical daughter, who was 2 years older than her, certainly was at a much greater trajectory at this age than Quincy was. And so we were bringing it to the pediatrician every week. We would go in because she wasn't gaining weight and she was spitting up and she was really essentially a failure to thrive. And there was nothing wrong with her neurologically. She was totally seemingly normal. And they just said, she has reflux and she needs to get through this. And finally, at about 3 months, we asked to see a neurologist. We live in Manhattan, so we're surrounded by the best hospitals in the world. And we really just tried to get in to see somebody to talk about what we were seeing, because it really felt like she wasn't tracking, she wasn't following, she wasn't lifting her head up well, she wasn't pushing up on her arms very well. And everyone said it was just from reflux. So we finally made an appointment with a neurologist, and at about 5.5 months of age. And they told us that they could see her when in the next available appointment was in 6 months. And we're like, that's double her life. So our first appointment was scheduled for a year from her birth. And so that was unacceptable. And my husband and I, like I said, both work in the veterinary space, do a lot of research and have a lot of collaborations and connections in the human field. And so we had to call in a favor. And we called one of the local university hospitals and asked to see a neurologist by a friend who got us in with somebody within 2 weeks. And we went and saw him, and he told us that there was nothing wrong with her, that she was a little developmentally delayed. And actually what we were told is, worst case scenario, she might have a little bit of cerebral palsy. And we just lost it. We're like, a little bit of cerebral palsy? What does that even mean? And how do you say that to a parent? Like, that's not nothing. That could be significant, and that could be certainly something. And my uncle lives with cerebral palsy, so I know what cerebral palsy is, and that can be challenging for people as well. In hindsight, we only wish it was a little bit of cerebral palsy, but at the time we were devastated, and we essentially asked for to see a geneticist. They said they would do some blood work, they would do some genetic testing, but no one would ever pay for it. And so we said, fine, we'll pay out of pocket. And so we got the genetic testing, and then 2 weeks later they called us and said it was normal. And we were like, oh, okay. So we said, well, we'd like to see a geneticist, because we really feel she's just getting farther and farther behind, and there's something seriously wrong with her. And they took the referral for a geneticist, and we had that appointment 2 weeks later. And the night before that appointment, I got a phone call from this neurologist that he was preparing the referral letter to the geneticist, and a new piece of paperwork came in. And that new piece of paperwork said that she has a deletion on chromosome 15. And she either has Angelman syndrome or Prader-Willi syndrome. And it was over the phone, and I picked up the phone, and the first thing he said was, I have catastrophic news for you. New paperwork came in, and your daughter has been diagnosed with either Angelman or Prader-Willi. And so the first thing I said was, how do you spell that? All I heard was catastrophic and syndrome. And I was on the phone, and I'm a doctor, and I had no idea what this man just said to me. It was the worst delivery on the planet of a diagnosis like this. That was so unbelievably devastating. And we walked into the office of the geneticist. And of course, that night, the minute he said the word Angelman and Prader-Willi, I Googled it, which is what no parent should ever do, certainly not a doctor. And I opened the first thing that was on there, which of course also no parent should ever do, is Wikipedia. And I read all the things that Quincy will never be able to do. She'll never walk, she'll never talk, she'll never live an independent life. She will live a life of seizures. She will sleep 2 or 3 hours a night. She won't go to college. She won't have friends. She won't get married. All the things that go through your mind of your newborn little girl as a parent, and you just are destroyed in that one phone call. And we went and saw the geneticist, and we walked into his office, and he hands us a stack of papers about this big from Gene Reviews. And it says Prader-Willi syndrome, which was exactly what she doesn't have. But when you look at her symptoms, it's very clear that she had Angelman syndrome. And she was actually misdiagnosed, even though the data was clear. And so it was really a kerfluffle of a diagnosis. And I can only imagine how much worse it is for parents who don't know how to push, who don't have connections, who don't have a medical education, and who aren't going with their gut of going against what the doctor's telling them and going with their gut of what they believe is happening. And so we got the diagnosis very early at 5.5 months, almost 6 months. And most people get the diagnosis between age 1 and 3. And it's usually when they have their first seizure and they're in the ER and someone hooks them up to an EEG, and kiddos with Angelman syndrome have a pathognomonic EEG. And they see that, and any epileptologist will look at it and say, this kid has Angelman syndrome. And that's usually how people get their diagnosis. And it was the worst day of our lives, for sure, delivered in the worst imaginable way by someone who really dismissed us on every level. It was a really hard experience, and most people's experience is even worse.
And I'm really sorry to hear how that all played out. And to the point that you said, it sounds like there were a lot of delays, even for the degree, that you were early. It still sounds like it could have been done even earlier if there was, proactive management, people taking your complaints and concerns seriously. As soon as you were saying, hey, my daughter has something wrong, and taking that seriously rather than being dismissed. It sounds like at multiple angles you were being dismissed pretty early. And that's really unfortunate to hear because, having gone through medical training myself, you're not trained to do that. You're trained to listen to your patients. You're trained to, take complaints seriously and make sure you assess them rigorously rather than dismissing out of hand. And certainly the delivery of news via telephone rather than, an in-person meeting and having a fulsome discussion is obviously disappointing as well. So I'm sorry that all happened. And it, to the point too, sounds like you got an answer far faster than anyone else would for a very rare disease because you were knowledgeable. So I was just thinking to your point too, for someone who's not so knowledgeable, perhaps doesn't have many resources, perhaps not very medically literate, this could easily have gone on for a long time. If you keep listening to the doctors that you mentioned the stories at face value, you're like, oh, they're just spitting up too much, or they're just a little delayed, it's fine, we're gonna be okay, see you in 6 months when I get the referral. Okay, fine, I'll do what they say. And if you did do what the doctor said in this case, it could have resulted in even further delays in her diagnosis and appropriate care.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the story of most people. One of my closest friends in the community, her son got diagnosed at age 8. And she had been going to see geneticists and neurologists since he was less than 10 months. And it was always deferred as something else. It was, and they never just did standard genetic testing. And it just is unbelievable to me that it wasn't standard of care. And my daughter's still very young. And it has changed because now there's whole genome and whole exome sequencing that is more aggressively run than it used to be, but it's still not as quick as it should be. And it should be at the level of a pediatrician. You shouldn't have to wait for a geneticist referral or a neurologist referral. But I in the defense of the pediatricians, probably 80% of all kids that spit up are fine. So they thought I was in the 80%, why would they think otherwise? And why would they want to overreact to something that was probably not a problem? But when you come back week after week and you really are demanding something is wrong, at least appease me to say nothing's wrong by giving me data, not just telling me. And that's where parents just trust their doctors as the end all be all of data and information. And doctors are often wrong. We all are as doctors, we're often wrong. And that's okay. But we have to trust our patients and the parents of these kids because they know better. They live with it every single day.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, though, that since you've received this really devastating news, that you've done something about it, right? You said earlier you're starting to solve it. So curious about how you started going about solving it, how you went from devastation and just getting the news and managing that on a personal level to saying, I need to do something about this. Really curious about that process.
Yeah, I think, there are different types of people, and devastating news either paralyzes you or it motivates you. And as a clinician, when I only deal with very sick patients, I find solutions for my patients. That is how I was trained. That is how I think. I never tell a parent of one of my patients that there's nothing we can do until I've exhausted every possible option to give them. And that's just how I think, and it's how I practice. And so for my daughter, when we got this diagnosis, and I read there's nothing, no treatments are available, and there's nothing that can be done other than supportive care, my initial reaction, honestly, outside of like falling to the floor and crying my eyes out, and my 2-year-old asking me if I needed Band-Aids for my eyes because mommy was crying, her older sister, I stood up and said, we have to solve this. Because no one's tried doesn't mean we can't. And if no one else is going to do it, then maybe we have to. And whether that was the most naive thing on the whole planet, to think that I could do that, to think that I, veterinarian, had the capacity to solve this problem. But I had no idea what research was being done. I had no idea how to develop a gene therapy. I had no idea what it would entail to put a gene in my child's brain. But I just felt it had to be possible, because I was not a geneticist and my area of expertise was medical devices. So I had no idea about the background of genetic therapies for humans. And so I just jumped in and said, let me research everything I can. What is out there? What is being done? What is possible? What do we need to do for her? And that was my therapy. Like, I didn't go to a therapist, I went to PubMed. And that was how I dealt with the devastating news, was to try to find a way to solve it. And I was lucky enough to realize Angelman was really an interesting disorder, and people were working on this for decades. And actually, an amazing amount of work had been done in Angelman syndrome. There were mouse models, there were rat models, there was a gene therapy that was already tested in an Angelman syndrome mouse model, 5 years published before her diagnosis. Like, there was so much work that had been done. And of course, I'd never heard of it because this was not my area of expertise. So I was just blown away to see, and it gave me so much hope and optimism that I wasn't alone, that other people were working on this, and it had to be because they too felt it was possible to make a difference in this disorder. Like, why this one random disorder? Was there so much work being done? Once you understood the elegance of the genetics, you realized why. But at the time, I did not realize that. And so I actually felt so unlucky, but then so lucky that I didn't have to start from nothing. And there was actually an entire foundation before me that had done so much work. And if I can connect with those people and I can be part of that to help in any way that I could, I wanted to do that.
So how did you get involved with the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics? And tell us about that journey and what you've been doing since you've become part of that organization.
Yeah, so about a year after her diagnosis, so the first year when she got diagnosed, I just read everything. I called every scientist I could that had published anything in Angelman syndrome. I actually had no idea there was even a foundation. I was focused on the researchers and the clinicians, not on advocacy. This is like early Facebook. This is early social media. I was looking on the internet about, like, is there a listserv? Like, the first thing I found was a listserv of parents. I had no idea like there were even Facebook groups. Like, that was like not so much a thing in 2015. And so I really didn't go down the path of advocacy. I went down the path of science. And so I started calling everybody. And you would be amazed at everybody returned our call. And they wrote me back on email, like within hours. And I just got on the phone with people and I started talking to people. And a week after her diagnosis, a paper came out in the Angelman syndrome mouse model where they were able to unsilence the silent copy of her gene using an antisense oligonucleotide, an ASO. And it was a paper out of the Baylor College of Medicine. And the person who discovered the UBE3A gene as the cause of Angelman, Dr. Art Baudet. And he published this paper, and I called him. And I sent him an email, and he got on the phone with us, my husband and I, 3 days later for 2 hours. And we talked, and he gave me so much hope. that the science is so strong and there's so much potential for Angelman syndrome, but there was really not many people working on it from an industry perspective. There was a lot of scientists because the genetics was so elegant. And so really what was needed was there to be a leap to the pharmaceutical company, and that didn't exist. And so I went down this path of like, how do I bridge that gap? And the more I talked to people and the more conferences I attended and the more questions I asked, the more it was clear it was such a great decade to be a mouse with Angelman syndrome, but it wasn't the right decade to be Quincy with Angelman syndrome. And then I met a bunch of parents founded the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. So I met this amazing group of parents who had vision. They were such visionaries. And they said, well before Quincy's diagnosis, 8 years before her diagnosis, they said, we're gonna cure this. And I was like, cure's a strong word, what do you mean? And they were like, we believe in the science. There was a publication on a gene therapy that rescued the phenotype of the mouse model. This ASO rescued the phenotype of the mouse model. Why can't we do this for humans? We're gonna do this. And they brought together a team of scientists and they had a consortium. And this is well before consortia were like really a very popular thing. And they got people out of their silos and they got them together to say, we're gonna take experts in each area, neuroscience, molecular biology, epileptology, clinical medicine, electrophysiology, and we're gonna bring them together and we're gonna say, how do we develop drugs for this population? And I was like, I wanna be a part of that. And so I wound up joining the board of directors of this foundation and got to really know these scientists, and they were just unbelievable. They had every intention to make a profound difference in the lives of every child living with Angelman. And I believed that they would make a difference for Quincy. And so I gave it my all. And I said, what can I do to help this real mission and this real vision? And I wound up joining the board. Within the first 6 months, I became the chief science officer of the foundation. And I was tasked with creating a roadmap, what we call the roadmap to a cure. How do we get from mouse candidate to human candidate? Mouse candidate is not going to help our children, but human candidate could. And if we don't have a human candidate, we have to know, how do we get there to get that to humans and all the steps we need to get through IND enabling studies. And that's the path I understood. And so I didn't understand the neuroscience. I couldn't develop the drug, but I could take the developed drug and I could help advance it through those steps, of course, with a team of experts. And so we just put together a team of experts. We put together this discovery team, and we had 6 therapeutic platforms that either looked incredibly promising, like an ASO, like an AAV gene therapy, and we added a CRISPR gene editor, we added a hematopoietic stem cell autologous ex vivo gene therapy, a zinc finger, and we said, let's see if this could work in Angelman syndrome. What other models do we need? What other tools do we need? What is needed for drug development, and how do we ensure we can create the ecosystem to get from benchside to bedside if we don't have a pharmaceutical company that is supporting us? And we built it one step at a time. And we built this entire ecosystem from in vitro to in vivo to endpoints, biomarkers, consortium, to clinical trial design, master protocols, to natural history study support, to understanding the natural history of the disease. There's been an 18-year natural history study that started well before Quincy's diagnosis. And we put it all together and said, how do we make ourselves the lowest hanging fruit for industry? Thinking industry needed to come in and do this. But if we made it easy for them, they would come in. Little did we know, as we did that we would have to be the industry to actually advance it to the first human clinical trial for a disease-targeted therapy. That we didn't realize at the time, but that's really where it went. A lot of people were dabbling, they were interested, but they were not acting. And some companies were really interested in Angelman, but they were 18 months away from a clinical trial every year for 8 years. And by the time my daughter was 3, and they were still 18 months away from a clinical trial. And when she was 5 months, they were 18 months away from a clinical trial. We realized we maybe had to do this ourselves. We didn't want to, but maybe we had to. Maybe that was the only way to actually get to human transformative therapies. And so that was when we took those 6 therapeutic platforms, we raised the money to be able to get to human candidate. And then we were able to raise that money in 6 weeks, which was unbelievably incredible, by one wealthy family who believed in our ask. They believed in our roadmap, and they believed in the path and the milestones we were going to take to get there. They were very savvy, they understood, and they said, we believe you can do this. And they gave us the money with a lot of, obligations, milestones, and deliverables, and we succeeded. And within 6 months, we actually discovered our first clinical candidate, which was on the ASO, which was a human clinical candidate ASO. And that was the time where we said, we either need to pass this off to a pharmaceutical company to advance this to humans, or we need to do it ourselves. And we decided to de-risk it further and do it ourselves. And that's when we decided to start a company. So we started a company called Ultragenyx Biotherapeutics that was launched out of FAST. I was the co-founder of that company and served as the chief operating officer of that company. And I was responsible for advancing the IND enabling studies with the incredible support of a team of awesome people that believed in us. We had regulatory, clinical chemistry, toxicology, pharmacology, the inventor who was our chief science officer. And we were able to bring this forward through an IND really in an unbelievable amount of time in order to be able to get this, to file the IND and get to first in human. And while working on that, we were dealing with all of the other programs in the background, the AAV, the HSC, the CRISPR, and the like. And so really it was this balance of early discovery, preclinical, and getting a clinical candidate into humans to be the first proof of concept for human therapeutics. So it was a really, really exciting time. And we were able to do that. So it was wonderful.
And that's a remarkable story, that out of something truly devastating, like finding out your daughter has a life-altering condition like Angelman, to learning about the science behind it, to figuring out what you could do as a parent to contribute to the advancement of that science, and really identifying the gaps and saying, hey, there's a lot of interesting science being done, but there's a giant gap between, like you were saying, getting great data in a mouse model to translating that into a human. And it seems like that gap was the resources and really some of the expertise to take those findings from mouse model and advance it through key IND enabling studies, even building your own company to solve the problem that you saw that industry wasn't even willing to take up the mantle from that point. Because you'd think with good mouse model data, a pharma or biotech might be willing to take on some risk, but de-risking it yourself with the support of people who are really passionate about that area. I'm sure a lot of the donors were people who have been affected or had family members affected by Angelman syndrome. So very inspiring story that you identified the gaps and actually did something very concrete to advance the state of the art and state of innovation for Angelman syndrome. And I find that really admirable that you were able to do something productive. And it sounds like in a pretty short period of time in the grand scheme of biotech developments. That sounds like a relatively quick pace from getting good mouse model data to bring it into human studies.
Yeah, I mean, it was really record time. And I say that with all due respect, in that industry moves a lot more slowly, but they have a lot of layers to go through, right? We were a scientific team of 3. We were a team of 5, became 6 and 7, but we were really a scientific team of 3. And the decisions were made with every ounce of every decision being patient-driven, right? Is this safe? Was our number one decision maker. Does the efficacy look strong? And if it's safe and the efficacy looks strong, what is this going to cost? And at every moment, we pivoted where we needed to go. And when we needed to pivot away from one candidate to another candidate, we did that without needing layers of bureaucratic approvals in order to change your candidate, right? So we were able to do that in such a nimble way. And I think it's because we were small and there was so much on the line, right? It wasn't just, well, is this program stronger than our other programs? This was our program. And we had to find the best solution for these kiddos, and we needed go and no-go decisions quickly. And if it was no-go and the science didn't support it, we needed a no-go. But if the science did support it, it was a full-on go. And we were so well supported by our board, by the board of Ultragenyx, the company, so well supported by the FAST board, and so unbelievably supported by the community, who were so excited about this. And so it was really motivating. Every moment was so motivating, but we were driven by safety. That was the most important thing to us. And as family members, that has to be the most important thing at all times. And it allowed us, more so than the speed, it was the incredible devotion to safety that I think was so profound. And the number of experts around the world that heard this story and wanted to help. So I was not alone on this ride. This was a ride of unbelievable support by so many experts that knew a heck of a lot more than me. You know, my superpower was that I was so agreeable to what I don't know, that gap analysis is like the king to me, right? You need to understand where the gaps are. You need to understand what you don't know and who you need to bring in to solve it. And so I was really the one trying to figure out who we needed to bring in for every piece of this and make sure we had the right people around the table. And we really got the right people around the table. And I think that is really what led to its success, and then led to relationships with those people because they believed in us. They believed we were doing the right thing. They believed we had the right motivations, and we knew how to make the right decisions. And we weren't just flying by the seat of our pants. We were methodical, we were thoughtful, we were careful. And I think that is really the mantra we've led for all of our programs. And now, of course, we have many more programs behind it. But that is, I think, what led to being able to be surrounded by such amazing people. And it is the whole team that allowed this to be successful. I just am the storyteller at the moment.
You hit on a really interesting point, and we discussed this a little bit before the episode, around patient-driven development. And it sounds like it's come up in multiple ways, the emphasis on safety as well as speed, though. It sounds like there was no time to waste, but making critical decisions. And like you said, you know, unlike a larger organization that will be taking care of patients that have nothing to do with any given, you know, a big pharma will have tons of people who are not affected by the diseases that they're building therapies for. Not a knock on them for that. It's a really important work to do. Like, a lot of people will work on therapies that they're not personally affected by on the disease front. But because your team and you personally are being affected by this disease, that it really impacted the way you built your company, on how you were thinking about the science, and how the stakes were incredibly high and incredibly personal in terms of how it affected you and your family. So curious if you can dig in a little bit more about how real patient-driven development looks and what that meant to you and your team.
Yeah, you know, it's something we talk about a lot because patient-focused drug development, of course, is a coined term that almost all pharmaceutical companies either like to use or are supposed to use, right? So we hear it all the time from the FDA, we hear it all the time from drug companies and from biotech companies. And in rare, especially because the patient lived experience is so important. A lot of people talk about the fact that this company is, you know, the best company because they really believe in patient-focused drug development. And I believe that they mean to, and they try to, and they do the best that they can for having not been touched by the disease, and they're committed to the disease and to the patients. I believe that wholeheartedly. But when you go to bed every night and kiss a little girl and say, tomorrow's gonna be a better day, and you wake up in the morning and you say, I'm gonna work all day for you because I want you to speak, that's patient-focused drug development. And when I have to look her in the eye and say, I am or I am not going to enroll you in this clinical trial, that's patient-focused drug development. And I would never develop a drug for a patient that I would not give to my own daughter, because it has to be safe and it has to have the promise of efficacy. It may not be efficacious, we don't know. This is theoretical at this point, it's potential. But in order for us to truly and deeply give hope to families, we have to believe in it in our heart. And if I don't believe in it for my own child, I shouldn't develop it. And I feel so strongly about that we say no when we don't feel that it's the right thing to do, and we say yes when we do feel like it's the right thing to do. And sometimes it's the right thing to do, but doesn't have the returns that investors want. We're gonna advance it anyway, because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes we want it to work so badly, but the data doesn't support that it's working. Then we have to say no, even though it's the farthest thing that's advanced and it's the closest thing that may ever get to a patient. But we don't believe that it will work, or we aren't confident in the safety profile. And when you have to think about every decision like that, and you have to think about how you're designing a clinical trial so that it's going to be acceptable for an adult with Angelman syndrome. Well, I have friends who have adult children with Angelman. I know what it's like for them to struggle with getting them to a hospital. I know what it's like for them to struggle parking in a garage where there's no handicap spots. I know what it's like for them to struggle where they are in the hospital for 8 hours a day and there's not a playroom, or there's not a phone charger for them to charge their iPad, or they have nowhere to go but walk in circles around a hospital. I would never develop a trial or allow one of our companies to develop a trial that doesn't accommodate the needs of these families. It is number one that their experience is good, that we do everything we can that in our power, and of course a lot is out of our power, to support what we know in terms of risk, safety, and efficacy. And then of course, the human experiment is going to be the experiment that tells the story, but all we can do is utilize the information we have from a scientific perspective to do the best that we can. And sometimes that allows you to move faster, sometimes it makes you move slower. But we are willing to do that because the North Star is improving the lives of these kids and adults, and there's no way around that. And every company we start and every program we lead, we have to follow FAST North Star, which is the foundation, and that is to improve the lives of all individuals with Angelman. And that means I give my heart and soul to every one of our companies, but I give my heart and soul to every other company who I don't work for, who I'm not involved with, who I don't get deep into the scientific discussions with. But I advise every single company working on Angelman, and I treat each of them as if I am working for them, because I'm working for our kids and I want their drug to be the best and I want their drug to do what it's supposed to do. And it doesn't matter to us who wins as long as the kids win. And that is truly patient-focused drug development, when it's really more about the patient than anything else. And of course, in industry, it has to be more about, not more, but at least equivalent, if not more, about the returns, because you can't sustain yourself if you can't financially support the programs. And I get that, and neither can we. But we always make decisions with just a different first North Star, because we have to go to bed every night and wake up every morning to that child. And that's just different.
It's incredible what you've been able to achieve, and passion comes through very clearly. And I can tell from the work that you've been doing and what you've been highlighting that every single decision that you make is with the long-term goal in mind. And then one thing I noticed you saying is that even if a drug candidate might be viewed as our best shot, if it's not working, we need to be able to let that go, which I'm sure is still very difficult, but I can understand why the emotions would lead you to say, well, it's our best shot, let's just do it anyway. But it sounds like you have while your emotions inspire you to move forward and develop these drugs, you also have a mind to say, look, if this isn't going to work, let's not waste our time on it. If it is not going to work, we need to go back to the drawing board, and being willing to take that step, which I'm sure is very, very difficult, is a clear motivating factor, and that you, even while you are driven to develop the drug, that you have a thought process around but we still need to focus on the overall objective. If this is no longer the right thing, we need to be able to be rational and deprioritize a drug, even if it's going to set us back a while.
Exactly. And checks and balances is everything, and diligence is everything. And we have diligence teams, and we have, target profiles that we have to meet. And so we try to set our standards as industry should. But like I said, the decisions are always made is this going to be safe? Is this going to be effective? And if we can't meet that clearly, that we feel strongly about those criteria and those thresholds, then we have to cut and say, no, we're going to put that money that we were going to put into the next thing, and let's move, let's go, and let's pivot, let's change our direction, let's change our focus, and let's move to the next modality or to the next candidate. And it's very, very important and hard to make those decisions, but we have been really, really good about it, because we know that in the end, we can't have wasted years on something that doesn't work or that may not be safe.
Absolutely, it makes a lot of sense. Now, talking about the initial company that you started, Genetics, can you tell us a little bit more about how that's progressed, what the storyline was? Obviously, the patient-focused care development was part of that, but can you tell us a little bit more about how far that went along and how that's shaped out over time?
Yeah, that was a wonderful experience, really. And we're so lucky that it was such a positive experience, because I think it set us up for success for all of our follow-on programs, mostly because it gave us faith in humanity and faith in pharmaceutical companies that rare disease organizations are often frustrated by, to be honest, because of the changing priorities and the wind of investment and the number of rare disease programs that are being shelved constantly. So it really gave us faith in these really incredible organizations that believe in Angelman syndrome and in developing drugs for Angelman. And so obviously my day and night was this program for a long time. And we were lucky enough to partner this program. Again, we brought it in as funds from the foundation and then from angel investors. And then we were able to partner the program with an option to acquire with a company called Ultragenyx Pharmaceuticals for the phase 1/2 study, in which Genetics, our company, still were the sponsor, but we had the support of a ton of really amazing people from Ultragenyx that could help us run that trial. And then they had the option to acquire the company with positive phase 1/2 clinical data, of which they did. So in 2022, they acquired us. And so carrying that through and then having that acquisition happen, I was really, really lucky because I got to go with the program. So when they acquired the company, I got to stay on with the program, and I stayed on as a consultant because I was still working on all of the other programs at the same time, so I couldn't come on full time. But I was able to still see the program through, at least on the non-clinical side, because I was leading non-clinical for Genetics. And I got to really see that through. I got to see it through the phase 1/2 and all of the work that was still being done behind the scenes at Ultragenyx. And they were so committed and so passionate. And I do feel like we passed a baton from a motorboat to a barge, but the barge was still moving pretty quickly. And they were so committed, and they kept the motorboat really close behind because they wanted to ensure we were confident in them. And it led to a lot of confidence. And I couldn't have been more proud of passing off what we feel was our baby. And they've really carried it and cradled it through. And now they're in phase 3, and the data looks really strong, and that has been a really exciting time. And because of that, that acquisition and the foundation having owned a majority of that company, the foundation had a return of funds for that acquisition. And that allowed us to go back and say, that was such a great experience that we need to do it again. And now we need to do it again with our other programs that we were accelerating to human candidate back in 2016. And we got to human candidate with our AAV, our CRISPR, and our hematopoietic stem cell gene therapy. And it was so perfectly timed because when that money came back to the foundation, we were able to start an accelerator to do a genetics, but for each one of those 3 programs, and really manage them similarly with the similar goal to bring those forward, get human clinical data, find a very responsible pharmaceutical company that can be our partner, get that through a clinical trial, and ultimately into the hands of a responsible party that can advance it through a phase 3 and commercialize. Because as a foundation, we want to advance every program and let human data decide what's best, and likely a combination of things will be best, and ensure that responsible people that know how to commercialize can get it for global access, which is not what our foundation wants to do. We really just don't want anyone pausing or shelving promising science. We want to make sure we can get it to patients. And we feel the only way to do that is to have human data that's undeniable. And if that means we have to get that human data that's undeniable or deniable, fine, cut and go. But we need an answer, and we can't have it shelved with the unknown. And we can't have put all this money and effort in, and it never makes its way to find out if it works. And so that relationship allowed us to do that and advance this in an accelerated manner. And so now that's the role I'm playing, is more at the accelerator. I still have a beautiful relationship with Ultragenyx, and I still work with them as much as I can because they're wonderful. But I also work with Ionis, who's developing an ASO for Angelman, and Roche, who just passed off their program to another company, Oak Hill, who's working on an Angelman ASO, and then Encoded is working on an Angelman AAV mRNA. So there's other non-fast programs that are doing wonderful, and I try to support them all because I really think they're doing great work. And if I can help them move faster in a safe way, then that's my job as the CSO of the foundation, is to ensure that I give them my all. And so that experience with that acquisition was one of the best, because it really gave me hope that whenever we pass this off to a third party, they have to be at least as responsible as Ultragenyx has been, because they've been such a great partner.
And it's great to hear that you found a company that was willing to take over the program and has the capacity to see it to fruition. So that's really wonderful that you didn't have to do it all through
yes.
the companies that you've built anymore, that there are other companies out there that have the capacity to take the baton and advance it forward, like the analogy you were saying. And it's really interesting from the foundation perspective and from the mother with a child with the condition perspective that you're not married to any one program, that you are only focused on one thing, which is the patient benefit. So if one program wins over even the company that you built, that's okay.
Great.
From your perspective, right?
Put me out of business. I will help the next neurodevelopmental disorder. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to hear a little bit more about the accelerator that you were mentioning, AS2 Bio. Can you talk about how that works? Obviously, it received funds in part from that acquisition, but you don't hear about patient foundations turning into accelerators very often. So it's such a really interesting development in the growth of the organization.
Yeah, so, it was not my idea. It was our idea to start these different companies, but one of the investors in genetics, who's also the father of a beautiful little boy with Angelman, he's in VC, he's an investor, and it was really his idea, as well as our board members and the folks that were involved in the genetics board to think about, how do we create a fund? How do we create a fund in which we can bring in investor money? Because the foundation can't afford to carry every single program all the way through. It's $25 million at a minimum to go from human candidate to end of phase 1/2 clinical trial, and likely more. And so if we think about the amount of money you need to do that, and we have 6, 7 different programs, it's limited on what we can do as a foundation. We can't ask parents who need to be buying things for their children with special needs to be us relying on them to develop drugs for their kids. It is just unrealistic and is unfair. And so our feeling is these drugs have so much financial potential, and the ASOs are showing that why shouldn't we bring in people that understand drug development, understand biotech, and understand rare, to make an investment and believe in us. We have a track record. We know we can do this, and we strongly believe that if we do this with the attention to detail we've done it in the past, that the chance of failure is really low. And the ASO has been a proof of concept, right? That you can rescue phenotype in this disease. And if we can rescue phenotype in this disease, but with a one treatment therapy rather than a repeat dose therapy, and we can get this to people around the world, the chance of success for these follow-on programs is huge. And so we're so confident in their success that we feel like the parents need to take care of their kids, and we need to bring in the money of people that understand this process. So we decided to start a fund, and that fund is basically an accelerator. The accelerator is like a management company that has all of the right pieces of a biotech to run programs, from human candidate through IND enabling, regulatory, CMC, medical, clinical, ClinOps, non-clinical toxicology, bioanalytical, all of the pieces in order to be able to run that, but we're modality agnostic and disease specific. So if that's the case, we have to learn about how do you develop a hematopoietic stem cell gene therapy. Like the CMC components to that are much more complicated than the CMC components to an ASO. But then add a CRISPR that's non-viral delivered, that's a novel, a novel RNP construct, and has 3 different drug products for one larger drug product, right? That's complicated. So, the components to this are incredibly complicated, incredibly fun as well. But it allows us to be able to say, we have a master protocol we can use for everybody. We have a lot of borrowing we could do from each other. We have all of the regulatory interactions we can share with each other. We have the right of reference for every IND back to the other programs. And really the differences are CMC and toxicology. And that we're very capable of doing. And so it has been a really exciting time to watch this grow, watch the people that want to come in and be part of it. But then we have these portfolio companies for each modality because we take the license from a different university. And so they each have their own company. So our AAV gene therapy company is called Mavericks Bio. It was licensed out of the University of Pennsylvania, Jim Wilson's lab. And we advanced that through an IND. We filed our IND, and we should be in the clinic in the second half of 2025. And then right behind that is our hematopoietic stem cell gene therapy. We took that out of UCLA, and we're taking that program through an IND right now, and that should be in the clinic hopefully in the coming 18 to 24 months. And then right behind that is our CRISPR gene editor, which we took from Yale University. And so we have these companies, Mavericks, Transformatics, and Courageous, but the accelerator is managing them all. So we know exactly what's happening at each stage, and we can borrow expertise, information, assays. We need a UB3A expression assay, we need antibodies, we need biomarkers. We can borrow from each other. And the unique thing about us too is that we actually also give these assays to other companies working in Angelman syndrome, so they don't have to develop their own assays. So we really work in some ways in quite a pre-competitive place, so that why should everyone reinvent the wheel? Why should everyone have to live in a silo when we can develop drugs a lot faster if we share information? And so we're very good about ensuring we give what we learn to other people so that we can all share that information and move the programs forward for patients. And then at the end of it, may the best drug or biologic win. And I guarantee you it's going to be a combination therapy, and many different combinations are going to have incredible impact in different ways to different populations in different parts of the world. And they're all going to win. And so we just want to be able to provide that option for people and ensure we find, if not the best, what best combination that is. And so the accelerator has been really that leverage to be able to be a part of all of the different programs and have the same people leading those programs.
And that's a really unique model, I think. I don't know of any other accelerators that do that or have that mission-driven focus, that patient development focus. And it sounds like learnings from the genetics experience, the genetics company experience, and that successful exit has allowed you to take more shots on goal. And like you said, share learnings that are transferable across the companies. And like you were alluding to, the CMC, manufacturing, certain elements might be different, but a lot of similarities that allow you to accelerate the development process. You have learnings from regulatory submissions, I'm sure, and just that know-how that was hard won the first time, you can translate and give yourself more shots on goals and more opportunities to develop treatments for patients.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm curious, how is Quincy doing in all of this? Has she been in any of these trials? Has she benefiting from any of these therapies yet?
Quincy's doing great. Quincy is in a clinical trial. She is in an ASO clinical trial. I will not mention which one because there are 3, but she is in a clinical trial and she's doing fantastic. She is just such an amazing little human who is so resilient and such a little warrior. She is willing to participate, and she is just, it's hard being in clinical trials. It's hard what we put these kids through in terms of time and effort and expectations of them and testing of them, missing school, missing work, all of that. But at the end of the day, it's harder on the parents, at least for us, than it is on her. She is just such a sport, and she is thriving. She's doing great. And we are very, very lucky, and we're blessed that we have this opportunity. There are now over, I think, nearly 300 kids and adults with Angelman syndrome that are in ASO clinical trials. And there'll be about 600 more now that the phase 3s have started. So it's unbelievable to be able to say that we're watching before our eyes the community change and the excitement around what's possible for these kids and these adults. And the fact that, it's all open label data. So I can't say, what is real and what's placebo and what's not, but the stories you hear and the data that's being shared and the information we're learning about, and obviously I know these children and adults, so I see it. It gives you chills, it gives you goosebumps. You watch a kid who couldn't self-feed who's feeding themselves for the first time. You watch a kid who was sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night, and suddenly they're sleeping 10 hours a night. I got a text from a parent who said to me, "This is the first night in 10 years my husband and I have slept together." And this was 10 days after their first dose of their ASO. And it was, you don't understand the impact that has on a family when for 10 years you've been sleeping with your kid because they sleep 3 hours a night. and suddenly you can sit with your husband, like in their own bed without their child. And when you have newborn, that time goes by and you're like, okay, in 6 months, they'll be out of my bed. When they're on year 30 and they're still in your bed, it's hard. It's devastating for families. And these are the things we can't underestimate. And when you see and hear these stories, and again, they're vignettes, and this is an open label, these 3 studies are open label, and phase 3 will tell the story. So I don't want to overstep, but it gives you so much hope to say the brain is unbelievably pliable and plasticity exists. And when you see 17-year-olds doing things for the first time, similar to 4-year-olds doing things for the first time, and it makes you say, we used to always hear, well, if you don't do it at birth, there's going to be nothing you could do for these kids. It's not degenerative, but it's neurodevelopmental. And when you see these results and you say, well, that's not true. A mouse and a human are different. And the human plasticity is well beyond mouse plasticity. And we are seeing changes in adults and adolescents and teenagers that we dreamed of. That's something to be really excited about. And that motivates me every day to say, how can I get that or more, but in a single treatment therapy or in a better biodistribution, or how do we improve upon this 1.0, and the 1.0 we're so grateful for, but we know, like everything else, there'll be a 2.0 and a 3.0, and we have to keep up with the times and find the best solution. But I believe that what the ASO is doing for patients and families is profound.
Well, first off, I'm glad to hear that Quincy's doing okay, and truly sounds life-changing, the work that's coming to fruition with all of these different ASO therapies, as well as others that are coming along the path. It sounds like they do have real potential to make a difference in people's lives, and they're already making a pretty substantial difference in the lives of the small number of patients who are already receiving them. So really inspirational, really exciting to see and hear about that these drugs are really making a difference in a concrete way on people's lives, even as simple and as minor as you get to sleep in your own bed at night because your child is resting. Even if it's as minor in the grand scheme of life, right? Minor that you can sleep in your own bed, but truly hopeful for the potentially transformational benefit on these patients and their ability to do daily activities, to have more progress in their lives and function better. So really inspiring to hear, and it's even the small things, right? To your point, even
and what's
things like sleeping through the night.
What's super small to a family that has typical kids is enormous to our families. If you can only imagine having a newborn for your entire life, and suddenly you don't have a newborn anymore. It is when your wife can sleep through the night and not get up every 2 hours, that is life-changing. And when that goes on for 10, 20, 30 years, and suddenly you can sleep through the night, it's not little, it's enormous. And when when I think about my typical kids and their progress, and I look at Quincy and her progress, it's not comparable. But when I see our kids, generally, they're not degenerative, but they have, a typical kid progresses like this until age 25, where they start to go like that. If this is typical, an Angelman kid is progressing like this until age 2, and then they're flat. So they basically are flat after age 2 to 4. They never regress, but they stay at a developmental level of about age 2 to 4. And when you see a 17-year-old start to progress their developmental level, what is 25 years going to look like? What is 10 years going to look like as they get closer and closer to neurotypical? And yeah, they still have a long way to go, but they're making progress. They're having a huge difference. Our kids speak on an iPad, but they often don't have a finger point. So they understand the symbols on how to communicate. But if they don't have an isolated finger point, they can't hit the symbols. When these kids are developing a finger point, and you go from one icon on your iPad to 150 in 3 months, and you are communicating what you need and what you want and what hurts and what you feel, that's indescribable. It's indescribable if you can only imagine never having a conversation with your child. It's indescribable. And so this is what parents are claiming they're experiencing. And it's just wonderful.
Yeah, truly life-changing and fabulous news, and really glad to hear that progress. So when we're thinking about, our Nucleate audience, our Nucleate membership, a lot of people are starting companies, and candidly, they might not necessarily be directly affected by the disease. They're inspired to treat diseases. They want to make the world a better place, but perhaps aren't being directly affected by a disease. So we talked a bit about patient focused development in your frontline experience doing it yourself. I'm curious though, what lessons do you wish people would know, whether they are starting their own company, whether they're at a pharmaceutical company? What lessons do you think you can provide to people who are inspired to make a difference in the world, want to develop new therapies, want to make patients' lives better? How would you advise someone, based on your experience having been a parent with a daughter with a condition, how would you advise someone starting a company, building a company, etc.? How would you advise them to have that patient focus in mind? How could they better develop therapies that serve patients' needs and really keep the patient at the center of it? How would you suggest going about that?
I think there's a lot of ways you can do it. And something that I think, is really easy to do is really listening to the voice of the patient or their parents. And that includes whatever disease it is you're working on. Let's just say it's Angelman. And you're not touched by it, but you're inspired by it, right? So if you talk to parents, which you should do on a regular basis, of course, because you're developing a drug, you have to know what's meaningful to them. You have to know their risk tolerance. You have to know what they are looking for out of this. And keep in mind, what you think you would be looking for out of this is generally not what they're looking for out of this. And so you need to take your personal opinion and biases out of it if you're not touched by the disorder, and actually listen to the people that are touched by it. And I can give you a good example, because if you listen and you have quotes from families that you repeat at every team meeting, this is what the parent of Quincy said about Angelman syndrome. This is what would be meaningful for her. And now let's get on with our meeting. You will remember your North Star. You will remember what you're working for. And this is a good example. I was talking to somebody about Angelman in all of our programs. It was actually a doctor and a physician. And she said to me, I was explaining all the different programs we're working on, one being the hematopoietic stem cell autologous gene therapy program. And she said to me, well, no parent would ever do a bone marrow transplant to their kid. It's not degenerative. And I looked at her and I said, have you ever lived with Angelman syndrome? Have you ever had a bone marrow transplant? And have you ever had an autologous bone marrow transplant? Not an allogeneic. Because if the answer is no, I don't think it's right that you feel you can judge me, parent, on what you would do for my child, because I can assure you, I would do a bone marrow transplant on my child to give them a shot to have UBE3A expressed throughout their entire body and into their deep brain structures because of the biodistribution benefit of autologous stem cell therapy in a minute. And I would go through the transplant, which is going to be a month of struggle and hardship and pain for my child to have a chance to have UB3 forever. So until you live a day in my life, please don't judge whether you think that is appropriate or inappropriate, because you are not living in these shoes. And this individual was like, well, they need to be on immunosuppressive therapy for the rest of their life. And I said, no, it's autologous. You're uninformed. They don't need immunosuppressive therapy for the rest of their life. Well, they're going to need to have, blood transfusions. No, they're not. It's partial conditioning because they don't have leukemia. They don't have sickle cell. We're not trying to ablate their entire bone marrow. We're just ablating enough to make room for their stem cells to carry the UBE3 gene so they can cross the blood-brain barrier, which means we do not need to do a full ablation. But until you know the details, and until you've experienced this, and until you've asked a parent what they're willing to do, please don't judge what you think you would do. And I can assure you, most parents feel the same as me. But we hear this all the time, this judgment of, well, you would do a spinal tap every 3 months in your child? If it can allow my child to self-feed and sleep through the night, yes, I would. Don't judge when you don't know. So hear the voice of the parent, hear the voice of the patient, and repeat it to your team, right? Because a lot of team members do a majority of the work, but they're not the ones on the front line who are speaking at conferences. They're not the CMO. They're not the medical lead. So they're not hearing from parents. So they're working their butts off on bioanalytical and toxicology and pharmacology, and they're doing all of this work, but they never really heard the voice of the patient. And so start your meetings off with quotes from families. Ask them honest and truthful questions. about what's their day like, what's their hardest day like, what's their best day like, what are their dreams, what are their hopes, what does minimal meaningful change mean to them? Can we try to provide that for them? And if you bring that to the table at every turn, I think you have a chance at patient-focused drug development. Because every decision I make, I have that innately. So I'm at an advantage to any of these companies because I live with that. But, so many people judge and they only have typical kids. Of course, you cannot ever be in my shoes to understand what I'm willing to do for this child. You couldn't imagine I gave up my entire career for this child. It was worth every penny because she is worth it, because I know that we can change her life and the life of others, not just with Angelman, but other neurodevelopmental disorders like her. Angelman is just the low-hanging fruit example, but the neuroplasticity of neurodevelopmental disorders is obvious. Rett syndrome is seeing similar things. There's no reason to believe otherwise, but we wouldn't know unless we tried. And when I hear people saying, like, I can't believe you anesthetize your kid every 3 months for an ASO intrathecal injection, and I was like, do you want to come over for one day and tell me what I live with and what you'd be willing to do to have a better life for her? Please. And it's true for the regulatory agencies as well, right? They make a lot of judgment on risk tolerance, benefit risk. Until you live a day in our life, you have to listen. Listen to what we're willing to go through, because the risk of doing nothing is far greater than the risk of doing something. And that's what people need to understand. And most people that just live with neurotypical kids don't understand that.
And I think that's incredible advice to ensure that every day, even if you're not directly affected by the disease, that you're thinking about the people who are. And even if someone's job is in, like you said, the bioanalytical side of things, or if it's in some really technical, deep computer side work where you're away from the bedside, keep the focus on the patients. Yep. Bring in quotes. Honestly, sounds like it's even worth bringing in patient families for an entire company to get exposure to understand why you're doing this. What are the problems that you face on a day-to-day? Move beyond, checking out what the P value is on your study for a second, take a break from that and make sure you're understanding why are you doing this and how are people who are living with the condition every day affected by it.
And every slide that you present, have a picture of a patient on it. And, I go to a lot of pharma companies and give talks, and we do have lunch and learns, and I bring my daughter and whatever. I give a lot of talks. But one thing I would say is when you go into a pharma company, right, and all of their rooms are named after stars or trees or streets or cities or countries, and then you go to a pharma company and all their rooms are named after patients, it's different. It's different. If you're a drug development company, you should be naming your rooms after patients, because that is your North Star. You should be there to improve the lives of the people you are serving. And you do good, you will do good, right? That's how you make money, by bringing transformative treatments to patients. It's worth something, and that's how you make money. And it shocks me how often that's not there.
Yeah, that is surprising, honestly.
Right.
But truly makes sense. If you want to be a patient-focused organization, there are a set of things you can do. Yeah. Including naming, I say as small as, it's really important, right? As small as naming a room after a patient, it's not small, right? It's right. Keeping your focus. When you walk into a room and you're about to have a meeting, why are you doing it? Who are you doing it for? So it's not just like slapping a name on a room. It's about what does that mean and what does that say about you as an organization, and how do you continuously center yourself around what the mission and North Star is of your company.
Totally agree. Start the meeting with what's the name of this room and what is that about? And what disease is that about? What is this? Just, it's a very simple thing to do that just creates culture.
Absolutely. So on that note, any final words of wisdom for entrepreneurs, executives in our audience, people who are trying to make a difference for patients? Any final words of wisdom for them?
Yeah, I think that people's biggest failures is not recognizing what they don't know. And as someone who came into this, I didn't walk up the ladder of drug development, promotion to company to company to company to become a founder. I was a founder because I had no choice, not because I wanted to, because no one else was going to do it. And so a team of parents and family members came together and said, we're going to start a company. You need to believe in yourself and be confident in yourself, but don't be afraid to say, I don't know. And don't be afraid to ask for help. And there are consultants around the world for everything. But doing a good, thorough gap analysis and really understanding how to best meet your goals and not making assumptions is really critical. And I think that's the key to success, is understanding your criteria to stop, understanding your criteria to go, and understanding if you're not sure. And then bring in outside people to help guide you. Because as people that start companies and are startups, sometimes you're doing this for the first time and you just don't know, but there's a lot of hubris about, well, I'm a founder, so I have to know everything. I have no arrogance at all. I know I don't know everything, but I also know I know a lot of people who know a lot more than me. And therefore, if I surround myself with the best people, we together will come to the best solution. And then I am proud of us. There's no me and I, it's us and we. And if you work that way and you're not, a narcissist and arrogant and believe you know everything, you're going to be much more successful. The people that go at it alone and are afraid to ask for help and are afraid to just admit that maybe they don't know, those are the ones I see failing time and time again. And I think it's important to just ground yourself and realize you don't know everything. You may know everything about that technology, but you don't know how it's going to behave in an animal. You don't know how it's going to behave in a human, and you don't know about the lived experience of the disease. So surround yourself with the people that do know that, and be willing to accept that it might not go the way you plan, but what's your backup plan? There's always a solution. Just have a backup plan, stay confident, and keep going. And don't just give up because you failed once. And a lot of people they move on to something else because that failed, and it could have been hugely successful had you not made that mistake. Go back, do a postmortem, figure it out, and see if there's a place to pivot before you give up. And I think that's for entrepreneurs and people that are in startups and founders, I think that's really, really important. Stay humble and realize what you don't know, and surround yourself with people that are really going to help you.
Fantastic advice. Thank you so much today, Allison, for joining the podcast. Fabulous discussion. And I'm sure everyone who listens is going to learn something.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate Podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.